Here we go. Hey guys, this is Saad for the Sad Truth. Today I have one of the great evolutionists who I only just found out retired. Maybe he'll tell us about his new stage in life. This is Professor Randy Thornhill, who is a professor emeritus of biology at University of New Mexico. I visited University of New Mexico back in 2006. We'll talk about that. Randy's research interests span insects all the way up to humans, and I think maybe peppered with some bird, maybe one or two bird studies. Some of your interests include facial attractiveness, facial and body symmetry, the menstrual cycle, the major histocompatibility complex, a set of genes that link up with your immunogenetic profile, human sexuality, Parasite-Stress Theory, the digit ratio, among many other topics. So we could talk for about 6 hours straight. Your books include a classic in entomology, The Evolution of Insect Mating Systems, back in 1983, when I had just graduated from high school. My goodness. A Natural History of Rape. We'll talk about that. That caused a lot of unnecessary controversy. The Evolutionary Biology of Human Sexuality, of female sexuality, and then the Parasite-Stress Theory of Values and Sociality. Did I cover pretty much everything, Randy?
You did.
All right. Well, it's good to see you, Randy. I guess we'll start with when did you retire from the University of New Mexico?
It's been about 2 years now. I retired from my, teaching position there. So I'm not teaching anymore. I'm doing a little teaching via this mechanism. That is, I'm giving lectures here and there at different outlets and universities. And so I'm doing, keeping the teaching going a little bit that way, but not any classroom teaching.
Do you feel a sense of relief that you're no longer doing that? Or is that something that you missed? Do you regret that you're no longer doing it? Where do you stand?
Miss it. I miss the classroom teaching. And I'm a teacher at heart. I really value that. And but I'm still dabbling a little bit in research.
Right. And by dabbling, it's probably you're still more productive than 99% of other academics, but you're too modest to actually say it. So I'll say it for you. Now, but what do you? I mean, so you're. I think you're 20 years older than me. I think you're born in, if you don't mind me saying, 1944. I'm 1964, so I'm about 20 years behind you in terms of my career. And I have to say, I'm also someone who adores, teaching and being in front of the classroom, and I'm a performer, and I'm passionate, and I'm animated. But I have found that at my stage of my career right now, some of the administrative elements of our profession, whether it be the departmental stuff, the administration stuff, the woke stuff, the grading, the whining, that stuff I've really grown to be very impatient of. Is this something that bothered you, or you were willing to suffer those costs because you love teaching so much?
I did my best to minimize it, and was pretty successful at minimizing it. Basically, the argument was, look how productive I am research-wise, look how good my teaching reviews are, and so don't put me on a lot of committees. The university was very kind. I never learned how to type. In the culture I grew up in, only women learned to type, the old South.
All right.
So that was an argument for giving me a secretary very early on. So I had a very, very capable and wonderful secretary for my whole career who handled just about everything that I need.
Wow. It's funny that you talk about typing, because I should probably do a whole episode, a short episode talking about this. Probably the most pragmatically relevant course that I ever took was in grade 9. We had these half courses, and I took a typing course at the time. So this is probably 1980, maybe. It was still on typewriters, where we had to learn how to use and I learned how to type the way that a secretary would. So I think, so even till today, you can dictate something to me and I could type without looking. And I have found that, given the subsequent career that I've had as an author, that it's probably been the most practically relevant course that I've ever taken.
Oh, yeah, I can understand that. I can hunt and peck, but most of mine are just scribbling it out and giving to the secretary, and she does a good job in making it look good.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Now, did you you said that we'll just talk a few more minutes about your sort of the new stage of your life as a retired professor,
Yeah.
and then we'll go on to technical stuff. Do you find that what you're doing now with this new medium is something that you kind of discovered after you've retired, or was it something that you sort of always had a vision that this is, I really want to get into these new mediums?
Just something I kind of discovered out of interests that others have had in the work. So they contact me. I mean, that's what we're doing here today.
Exactly.
And so I talk about my research and so forth. And that has a teaching element because there is an audience of people who are interested and open-minded and so forth. And a lot of my stuff requires some open-mindedness, as you know. So I just use it that way and enjoy it very much.
That's wonderful. All right, so let's get down to some of the scientific stuff. So you were trained in your PhDs in zoology. Your background is in entomology. How did you make the switch, or not the full switch, because I'm sure you dabbled back and forth, but what led you to say, okay, let me now take some of my evolutionary insights and apply them to the human animal rather than to, the insect taxa? What was that switch? How did it happen?
Let's see. Longstanding interest in human behavior and psychology, even as a kid, trying to figure people out a little bit. And but then all of a sudden, in the 70s, there was launched, the application of evolutionary principles to animal behavior. And a few people were thinking about the application of evolutionary principles to human beings. And much of that was going on where I was in the graduate program at the University of Michigan. Dick Alexander and a little bit later Bill Hamilton and so forth was there. And so it was much in the air. And it struck me as something that I was very interested in, and wanted to figure people out. And of course, evolutionary principles, that's the way to do it, as you well know.
Well, I mean, you and I know, and it seems terribly obvious that it could be the only way. What other game in town could there be other than applying the evolutionary lens to understand human beings in general and our human mind in particular? And yet, maybe a bit less so, but it remains highly controversial. Have you seen in the 40 or plus years that you've been trying to do this, applying EP, evolutionary psychology, to the human condition, are you seeing lesser resistance, or are we still fighting the same battles?
I think there's less resistance overall. There's still a lot of anti-intellectualism toward applying evolutionary ideas to human behavior and psychology, and naivete, basic failure of Western education systems that don't start teaching kids in grammar school about evolution and building on that. That would be that would really be in people's interest, because you don't have any self-knowledge really unless you understand yourself as a product of evolution, and certainly can't understand the humans around you without that knowledge. So that's about as fundamentally important for the education of a human being as any other area of knowledge. So that's kind of how I got into it. Just a fascination with people. The culture I grew up in was very weird. The Old South, very conservative culture, like the one you grew up in, I'm sure. Very much overlap there with basic ideology and so forth. And those folks fascinated me. I wonder how they got in that shape, because I was different from them in general, the conservatives there. And then later I got into academics and a bunch of liberals, and wondered how they got in that shape. Serious research on corvees of people. Yeah.
So your early career was in entomology. Then, of course, your subsequent career was a lot more with humans. How often have you reverted back to studying
I'm
insects?
still reverting back. I've got a project going in a field project now that I'm hopefully finishing up this year in the spring and summer in Alabama on insects called hanging flies. And a weird thing that I started when I was a grad student, I didn't finish that part. So I'm going back to that. And I just published a paper, at the end of last year on scorpion flies mating and traumatic mating practices of males in these scorpion flies, Japanese or Chinese scorpion flies. So I'm doing some of the insect stuff still, dabbling with that, but mainly my interests are primarily in human behavior and psychology.
Now, I don't know if you're ready to answer this, and if you're not, that's okay, because it causes us to have to think on our feet. How when we so if we look at the tree, the evolutionary tree, I mean, the insects are quite removed from us. I mean, we're closer to certainly chimps, to dogs, than we are to insects. But are there any homologies or analogies, so homologous or analogous trait that, for our general lay people audience, that you could say, here are two homologies that we share with insects, or analogies that we share with insects? Has that been studied much?
Well, the analogies are there. That is the convergent evolution of traits. Female choice works about the same way in insects I've worked on as it does in humans, in the sense of females going for resource-providing males, females going for males with high genetic quality. I mean, those are principles of femininity across the whole female phenomenon, from even insects or flatworms all the way up to primates. And so you got those kinds of analogous traits, and male-male competition patterns and so forth are similar and analogous. The homologies, that is not something that I'm an expert on. I mean, they're, the cell structures and so forth, same even with one-celled organisms. We got those homologies, homologous features. And of course, the genetic material has homology all the way through the tree of life. But
has anyone studied? So you would expect that the closer you are to another animal in the kind of the grand taxa of life, then the more homologies you are likely to have identified, right? So you're closer, there are X number, you're further, there are X minus delta. What I just said, has that been documented?
Oh, that's true. That is, the tree itself is built upon degree of homology.
Oh, beautiful.
So fundamentally, the tree is a description based on research on homologous traits. Genetics is often referred to, just look at the genetic homology and you can build the tree. But then on top of that, you got morphology and physiology and so forth that backs up the branches and how they're related to one another and so forth.
Exactly.
Tree. Yeah.
See, what I love, I mean, what made me fall in love with evolutionary theory in general, and then evolutionary psychology in particular, is because I think the way my brain is wired is that I'm very much of a synthetic thinker, right? So to borrow a term from another Alabaman, also an entomologist, E.O. Wilson, who recently passed away, right? Yeah. He's the one who kind of repopularized the term consilience. Right. When you think with an evolutionary mindset, everything gets connected, right? So I can now use parental investment theory, Trivers, and I can show how, the sex differences that you just mentioned regarding the female mates, how they choose in the fly context, is the same as you. So, I mean, to me,
the consilience. I mean, if you're interested in consilience, which hopefully, people interested in science are, but at varying levels, then evolutionary theory is where it's at, because it's general theory of life. And so if you're, want to seriously think about and work on living things at any level, you got to be a devout evolutionist for sure. But Ed Wilson and I, we came from the same place, same town.
Oh, same town.
Yeah, same high school. And
That I did not know that. My goodness. So
oh,
he would have been about 15 years older than you, correct?
yeah, right, right,
Okay.
right.
I mean, did
Oh
you
yeah,
get
we contact quite often. When I first got started, I went to Harvard a number of times and lectured and so forth. I was about the only one working on insects from sexual kind of things. Ed and his group were working on different areas of
right?
social life and insects. But I did the original study of mate choice in a field population of animals. It was an insect study I did of mate choice, and so I was kind of all alone at that point. And then people really got into it, and behavioral ecology arose and that sort of thing. So yeah, Ed and I went way back.
Oh, that's amazing. One of my favorite quotes of his, maybe my favorite quote, which relates to his work with social ants, is, and I'm sure you know it, when he was asked famously about his opinion regarding communism slash socialism, he said, "Great idea, wrong species." I thought that was such a. Did you know that quote?
No, I didn't know that quote actually. No.
Because I mean, and again, that, by the way, captures one of the most important lessons that I try to teach my students, which is understanding human nature allows you to design products that are maximally congruent with human behavior. It allows you to design political and economic systems that are either antithetical to human nature or congruent with human nature. And what E.O. Wilson was able to do with that one little pithy quote is demonstrate that, yes, for social ants, communism is great, maybe not so great for humans. I thought that was just brilliant.
Right. Yeah, that is. Yeah.
All right. Before we get into some more technical stuff, as I was preparing for our chat, I wanted to kind of quickly glean through your CV, and I noticed that you've got a couple of behavioral and brain sciences papers. And in a recent chat I was having with a good friend of mine who's also a fellow academic at my university, we were both saying that it would be fun for no other reason than the sheer joy of doing such a paper to write one. Now, let me first explain to our viewers what a BBS paper looks like, which is
Yeah.
different from other journals. And then I'd like to get your take on how it was for you to navigate the BBS process. So the way that the journal Behavioral Brain Sciences work is there's one target article, this massive, beefy article that someone writes, a couple of authors write, and then so you get a solicitation of a whole bunch of other people to write these commentaries, typically big experts in the field, and then the authors get a chance to rebut those. So within that one issue, you have everything you wanted to ever know about, say, the evolution of empathy or whatever the topic is. So how was writing those papers compared to anything else that you've done in your career?
Well, it's a chore for sure. Because you get, people, the commentators are all over the place and always interesting, but it's quite a chore to try to give everybody some time when you're responding and being polite, of course, and productive, trying to be productive and constructive on the basis sometime of comments that are irrelevant.
But you still have to make them feel as though they were heard.
That's right. You have to touch. Yeah, exactly. You have to touch on everybody when you do the response article. But those journals, that journal is good in terms of impact.
Yeah,
Gets a lot of readers, and so you get a lot of interest that way. And it's cross-disciplinary, which is nice. You should consider something like that for your interest to, say, I don't know what you'd call it. Let's say evolutionary science in marketing,
yeah,
or something like that.
yeah. I would actually. I thank you.
There's now a literature.
Yeah.
I mean, because of you and some others, a literature you could draw on to show the empirical power of that connection and discovery power of that connection between marketing and evolutionary science, and then see what people say. And as you know better than I certainly, but everybody who works in business economics hadn't heard of evolution.
Oh, boy, do I know. I was the lone wolf for many, many years before now it's becoming sort of cool. So
Well,
I still receive some animus. I mean, much less, as you said.
yeah,
There's
it's
lesser.
got better.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
gotten better, but there's certainly, you're right, that there is now a at least a small critical mass of folks housed in the business schools who are trying to apply the EP lens. And as a matter of fact, I have to thank you because in 2006, as I think I intimated in our intro, for those of you who don't know, University of New Mexico has, one of the top, evolutionary groups, I guess certainly across North America.
we're
And
all retiring though now.
they all retired. That's right. Is that true though? I mean, Steve Gengestead and all these
Yeah,
guys.
he's retired. He retired
Oh, no kidding.
about a month ago.
Oh, wow. Well, there was a whole bunch of real superstar evolutionists that were there, and in 2006, prior to my first book coming out, you guys had invited me out there, and
Yeah.
it was such an honor, privilege. I mean, it was amazing. Do you remember that visit?
Well, yeah, that was great. Sure was.
That was amazing. Not from University of New Mexico, but from that trip that I also remember is that I had connected with a wolf sanctuary. I think it was about 2 or 3 hours away from Albuquerque, and they were kind enough to invite my wife and I to visit the sanctuary, and we actually went inside the enclaves with adult wolves. They had warned us, don't act strange, be calm. I said, I'll be totally calm. I mean, I grew up with Belgian shepherds who are really like wolves. They're these big military dogs. And so one of the great things that I remember from that trip, other than coming to visit you guys, was that the magisterial nature of hearing a wolf howl from about 2 feet from you was one of the most magical things I've ever experienced.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that wolf sanctuary that I'm talking about?
There are wolves now at the Albuquerque Zoo. They've got a big display of wolves. And then there's a wolf thing I took my youngest kids to years ago inside Albuquerque.
Oh, no. This was probably like in the middle of the boonies, like maybe 2 hours away.
I'm not familiar with that now. I don't think it exists now.
Oh,
Yeah.
is that right? Okay. Are you still living in Albuquerque?
Yes, uh-huh.
Oh, so you consider, obviously you've been there for many years, so you wouldn't consider leaving now that you're retired?
I don't think that's going to happen. Yeah. I like where I live and all that. Yeah.
I got you. Just last point on University of New Mexico. In the talk that I gave, when you guys had invited me, there was a young undergraduate student at the University of New Mexico who ended up coming to my university, and he did a thesis with me because he had come to that talk. So look at the beauty of life, right? I mean, had I not been giving that talk there, I would have never met that student. And then he went on to do a PhD at McGill. I don't think he stayed in academia, but his name was Zach Mendenhall. I don't know if you ever interacted with him.
I don't remember him, no.
Yeah, I think he was more into the evolutionary psychology part of things, and he also knew Jeffrey Miller, I think, and so on. Well, Jeffrey's still there, right?
Jeffrey is on leave. He's now working for a university in China.
Oh, I see. Okay, I didn't know that.
That's a new development, and he's on leave, unpaid leave, and I think he's deciding what he's going to do. He's going to come back to UNM, or he's going to continue with the professorship in China.
Oh, I mean, I know you said that most of the folks that were there when I visited are retiring. Is there a new batch of folks, maybe not as illustrious, but that are coming in that are going to keep the program going?
There's a strong group in anthropology now. There's been developed, and especially in like social endocrinology.
Oh, right.
Angstead calls it social endocrinology,
Right.
Sex hormones and all their products and so forth, and psychological and behavioral products. That's is going strong. There are a couple of people still in psych. There's some new people in psych, and that's good. And but in biology, when I retired, they didn't. I was a very unusual hire for biology to study birds and insects and humans and all that, and rape and all these crazy.
Well, we're gonna come to that book. That's a juicy one. I remember during my visit at one point you and I were walking and I had pitched an idea to you, which I'll remind you of it right now, and I wonder if anybody has followed up with it. Hopefully they didn't steal it from me. This was the idea that I was telling you, could it be that men's testosterone levels go in sync with a woman's menstrual cycle, so that when she is least receptive to, sexual advances is precisely when you would see a dip in a man's testosterone, so that you synchronize their libidinal drives. Does that make any sense? Have you
partnered men and women, so they're in a romantic relationship?
Exactly.
And so the man can, we know that the man can detect where she is in her cycle. That research has been done. Men are much wiser about that than tradition, told us. And also men's testosterone level. Let's see. Yeah, it does go up when the man smells the estrus in the female.
Exactly.
Or senses estrus in the female, and it's more than scent probably involved, because her behavior changes and so forth, and even her looks change a little bit. It's more estrogen, she gets more attractive, and so the testosterone level does go up if for men temporarily. And these are not partnered men; these are just men off the street. You bring them in, and so that's going on. So I think that your idea was right. It would sound.
Oh, I think we found in a collaboration that we should have worked on back in 2006.
But back then, that was early in the study of menstrual cycle effects and all that kind of stuff,
Which is sorry, go ahead, finish your point.
But all that is still, that research is alive and well and going, we know so much about men and women's sexuality now that compared to 20 years ago.
So this leads me, since we're talking about menstrual cycle, it leads me to arguably, you tell me if it was the one that received the most attention of your papers. This is the one where you and Gengstead found, I think it was 1998, that women are able to smell, without seeing the men, to smell the symmetry of men. And so what I called it, and I'm sure you have a similar, I called it sensorial convergence, right? The idea being that whether I'm going to use one sense or another, they should converge as to what is the optimal product. Now, I want to link, before I ask you to comment on this, I want to link that paper to a paper that I always ask all my doctoral students to read. It's a 1971 paper called "That's Interesting!" by Davis. Are you familiar with that paper, Randy?
No.
Oh, I'm going to have to send it to you. It's a 1971 paper by a sociologist who was trying to come up with a framework to try to not quantify, but to try to come up with a set of criteria that would allow us to say what constitutes interesting research. Right? So, we could talk about research that's methodologically rigorous, research that's theoretically justified, well executed, but all of those things can be true, and yet the research could be terribly banal and uninteresting, right? Yeah. So how do we define what would be some metrics that we can use? And he listed a set of 12 criteria, slightly different from each other, but they all have one thing in common. We thought it was A, it turns out to be B. So we thought that X and Y should not be correlated, but it turns out that they were. And so it'd be very easy to fit that study of yours within several of these criteria, because it is rather surprising to know that women can smell symmetry. Yeah. So tell us about that paper. Is it the one that surprised you the most, that made you say that's interesting about your own research?
In a sense, the convergence of sensory components, as you mentioned. So visually, symmetry is nice for us to look at. We did those studies. We did. Carl Grommer and I did that study for facial symmetry and its role in attractiveness judgments. That's the visual component. And then Steve and I were wondering about how the scent component might be convergent with that. because symmetry is a marker of developmental health. It's that component of health. And so we did the symmetry sense stuff, and yeah, it was surprising that it works so well, and it's been done in multiple labs. I mean, it's real apparently.
Well, it's funny that you say it's real, because I was once talking to a pretty well-known academic. I won't mention his name, and he was so incredulous about that result, because we were talking about hormones and its effect on social behavior. And so I referred to that classic paper of yours, and he goes, I still have a hard time believing that. I said, well, what do you mean you have a hard time? You can't just levy that if it is what it is what it is. So I think it is one of those truly incredible findings that if anything demonstrates that we are animals, right?
Right. Well, one thing we didn't follow up on in that research, and no one else has either, is getting at. The hypothesis is that it's got that finding has a hormonal basis in the male. That is, more symmetric males smell better to women, especially when women are fertile in the cycle, because of their hormone levels, like testosterone or some combination of testosterone and, stress hormone, low stress hormone, high testosterone. So we never followed up that component of that research, which would be nice to look at.
Very interesting. All right, let's get to your. Oh, Randy, can I just get you to center your thing, because you're that's perfect. Yeah, because we're missing your mouth when you're speaking. Your most controversial, I think, work ever, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is the book that you published with Craig Palmer, the anthropologist, where you were arguing for some, using an adaptationist argument for why rape exists. And right. Contrary to what people think, that doesn't mean you're condoning it, doesn't mean you're justifying it. That's one of the reasons why people hate EP, because they think that if you offer a scientific explanation, that means you are for it, right? Which I usually give the answer, if that were true, then we should be picketing against oncologists, because if they're explaining cancer, then they must be for cancer. They are justifying cancer. They are condoning cancer. So tell us that whole story, because I remember you had told me that you had to have police protection. Tell us the story.
Oh, God, yeah, those were crazy years. Craig and I, we published the book, MIT published the book in 2000, year 2000. And the first thing, New York Times picked up on it, did a cover story on this. They didn't give a very favorable and very intelligent depiction of the book. And then the crap hit the fan, so to speak. The media and so forth got involved and said these guys are saying that rape's a good thing. We should let all the rapists out of the prisons and all that stuff. Give them a tax credit if they rape, that kind of crap. So that got a little weird, and there were death threats and. The university was very concerned because I was getting so many death threats and calls to the university to fire me and all this kind of stuff. And so the university had the campus police come to my classes. And I was teaching the evolution of human sexuality that semester. My routine course was very popular. And so the police sat through the lecture, and they enjoyed it. So they like that.
You got a few converts out of the police.
Yeah, right.
Wow.
Yeah, used to the police department. So that went on for a few years, and Craig and I, over the couple of years after the book was published, we did 600 media events.
Wow.
TV, radio, newspaper, magazines. We just split them. Craig and I, we both like to teach, and we use that as a teaching element. So, you got people that are interested in knowing some biology, and teach them some biology through those media contacts. And all the media wasn't crazy, but a big component of it was just anti-intellectual and stupid. about this stuff.
So this demonstrates, I mean, in a sense, what we today hear about cancel culture and the culture wars, which is, of course, something that I'm very much steeped
Right.
in, especially with my latest book, The Parasitic Mind. I'm talking about all these idea pathogens. Well, I first saw these idea pathogens proliferating in the context of my scientific work and in the context of seeing folks like you know, where people were trying to cancel you in 2000, way before there was the term cancel culture, right? I mean, E.O. Wilson was being canceled in the 70s. So this
same thing. It started with sociobiology.
exact. Do you think that this is just an inherent part of regrettably, the human repertoire of possibilities, whereby when people don't like something, they just want to, you know, decapitate it in one form or another?
Yeah, and if they think that will give them moral opportunity to moralize and to display to their in group, and that they're really good people, and people aren't really like this. That's, you know, the way evolutionists say they are. They're selfish and not altruistic and all that. Of course, that's not what evolutionists think. But the ignorance component feeds into that too. But even the, you know, Stephen Jay Gould phenomenon and all was incredible. He was part of that same ignorant level in opposition to real science.
Which demonstrates that even evolutionists, in this case, Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin, because they were parasitized by the Marxist doctrines, they couldn't be inoculated from, you know, tribal idiotic beliefs, right?
Right. They couldn't get away from it. They couldn't be objective. They couldn't see reality because of the ideology. Ideology is so powerful, and that's one thing that's led me into my the last 20 years.
Yeah, hold on this. This is the parasitic stress stuff, right? I want to get to this, but before we move from the book, so we kind of talked about some of the negative reactions to your book, but give us kind of the synopsis of the actual arguments in the book, so that anybody who might be watching this and, you know, have a negative view of what you might have said can be laid to rest.
Well, the reality with regard to sexual coercion, whether you're talking about in humans or in scorpion flies or birds or whatever, is that it is a mode. Sexual coercion is a mode of sexual selection. So you've got male competition as a intrasexual competition for mates. That's one mode. You've got mate choice. That's another mode, and sexual coercion is a third mode. And it's a way in which males can increase mating success and hence be successful in sexual selection. And you can. So it's fundamentally, if you're interested in sexual selection, you're going and serious about sexual selection, then of course you're going to be interested in sexual coercion, because it is a mode of sexual selection. And so the argument in the book was simply that that's true, what I just said. It's a sexual coercion of mode of sexual selection, so it's important for us to study that and understand it from the biological point of view. And it's important for us to understand it too, because it's a social problem in humans, and a big social problem. There's a lot of sexual coercion out there, rape and intimidation, harassment, the three kinds of sexual coercions: rape, intimidation, harassment. Very, very common in humans. And if we want to do something about it, then we have to understand its causation. If you got a problem, you need to understand its causation. When you do understand the causation of a problem, then and only then are you in a position to do something serious about it. And, these suggestions about how to stop our problems and so forth that aren't based on understanding causation, which can only come from science, are just everybody waste of time. But so that was one part, that we got to do the science on this stuff to get a detailed understanding of sexual coercion, and then we're in a better position to do something about it. So another part of the book was that sexual selection has created sexual coercion, but is sexual coercion in humans, reflective of an actual adaptation for sexual coercion, say a psychological adaptation for sexual coercion in men's heads, or is sexual coercion an incidental byproduct of adaptations in men for other purposes?
This is the adaptation versus exaptation story, correct?
Right. Okay. Those are the two alternatives. And that exhausts all alternatives in terms of the ultimate background of sexual coercion in humans. It's either reflective of psychological adaptation for rape itself in men's heads, or adaptations for things other than rape as a byproduct. Those are the two possibilities. And then that can be, that's good news. Then you've got it, it's involved in sexual behavior. That was one big controversy too. A lot of the 70s feminist ideologues did not like the idea that we were saying that rape has anything to do with sexual behavior.
Right. It's only about power. It has nothing to do with sex.
Right. That was the argument. And of course, that's very stupid. It's human behavior can have multiple motives. So when a guy is raping a female, he's of course he's going to be motivated to dominate her because it's forced copulation. That's a motive. He's motivated to do that, but he's also motivating her, trying to dominate her to get sexual experience. So you can have multiple motives involved in human behavior commonly. So that was one big issue that we fought. Yeah. The sex, rape is not sex ideology, and so there was a PBS documentary in the works about 6 months ago. They did multiple interviews with me.
A documentary about the experience of you having written the book and the subsequent reaction to it?
Was cast as a documentary about the history of feminism.
Okay.
The history of feminism. So, of course, all this controversy and so forth that the book generated was part of the history of feminism in their view. But I haven't heard from them. And I don't know if it washed out.
Does that mean, so you were preemptively canceled?
Yeah, well, it was, at least you would think the documentary would be maintained.
Yeah, right.
They've gotten mad because they included me or something. I don't know.
Maybe it's time. Are you gonna follow up with them, or you don't care?
I'm motivated now to try to follow up with them.
Let me know. Privately, let me know what happens with that. All right, let's move to what you teased us about a few minutes ago about what's been keeping you busy, among other things, for the past 20 years. Parasite-Stress Theory. Before you even give us your answer, one of your other great papers that I love, and I actually cite in my 2011 book, The Consuming Instinct, is the paper with you and Corey Fincher, one of your former graduate students, where you demonstrated that the distribution of cultural scores on individualism, collectivism, so Canada, US, Britain, individualist, Far East, Middle East, collectivist. Well, so someone like me who's housed in the business school, I've seen a million studies using Hofstede's, metrics, but you never get at, why they are distributed the way you are. So here you come along and say, well, look, we could superimpose the density of pathogens across these different ecosystems and show that countries that score higher on pathogenic load will score higher on collectivism. That's another one of those papers that score very high on that's interesting, because you would never think about making those links. So did I cover that correctly? And tell us more generally, what is parasite-stress theory?
At first it seems counterintuitive.
Right.
Disease, collectivism, individualism, connection. But then when you start looking at it, the connection jumps right out. And I can explain why.
Sure, go.
Shall I go there?
Please.
Yeah. So the parasite-stress theory of values, we call it the parasite-stress theory of values and sociality, because it's a general theory of sociality, is a scientific theory. So, and that is, we're interested in the causes of people's core values. And I'll explain what I mean by core values in a minute. Really, what we want and need as people. And core values have been studied a lot, and by psychologists, a tremendous literature. And you can really carve it, the core values phenomenon, in two ways. If you go to political scientists have this continuum: conservatism, liberalism. And so high conservatism over on the right, liberalism on the left. It's a continuous variable. If you're highly conservative, you're low in liberalism. High in liberalism, you're low in conservatism. So that's the way political scientists deal with the core values phenomenon. You go to cross-cultural psychology, and they have a different dimension in terminology, but we show that it's very fundamentally about the same dimension. And it's called collectivism and individualism, as you mentioned, for that. Hofstede's very important work early on with descriptive. That was descriptive. But again, what causes this variation is what we were interested in. And so let's start with the collectivism, conservatism end of the dimension, and to tie it to infectious disease. So if you, so lots and lots of research on the components of these core values, what's correlated with what, and so forth. So the components of conservatism are first xenophobia. That's one. And xenophobia is fear, dislike, avoidance of people on the outside, things on the outside, out groups. And that's the more conservative the person is, the higher the xenophobia of the person. That's empirically very strongly shown. And another component of conservatism is ethnocentrism, which is favoritism for people like you, the local group, your in-group, and so forth. And ethnocentric folks start with, the group starts with the nuclear family, then goes to the extended family way out, and others with similar values, like values, comprise the in-group of a person that's highly ethnocentric. And this more conservative, the more ethnocentric. Then other components are neophobia. Okay, neophobia.
Fear of the new.
Pardon me?
Fear of the new, just so that people, yeah.
No, it can be, it can be viewed as just a component of xenophobia, because the new can be a different person from the outside. But it can be different ideas, different foods. Your student.
Exactly, yeah.
Lately.
Yes, just for those of you who don't know what Randy's talking about, Randy was kind enough to accept my invitation to serve on the thesis committee of one of my recent students who studied these pathogenic issues as relating to conspicuous consumption and food neophobia. So thank you for that, Randy.
Cool research, yeah. So neophobia is one of them, too, a component of conservatism. Dislike, avoidance of new stuff, new ideas, new people, new foods, new ways of thinking, all that kind of stuff. And another is traditionalism. That's, conservative means conserve the status quo, right. Be traditional. That's where the conservative thing comes from. And authoritarianism is very strongly related to conservatism too. That is the liking authority, traditional authority. The conservative leaders, they love them, and religion, traditional religious beliefs, all that. Your knowledge comes from those components, traditional religion, the elders, the authorities, and so forth. Let's see, conformity is also a component of conservatism. You conform to the local values and local behavior. Everybody follows the same rules. Everybody knows the rules. They're simple, and you follow them. And another component of conservatism is philopatry. And philopatry comes from biology. It means love of your country, love of your place where you're born. And you like to stay there and live your life there. You don't disperse. And so those are really the components of conservatism. And if we start connecting that to infectious disease levels, the correlations come out, the connections come out very quickly. So xenophobia, for example, is dislike of people and ideas, and neophobia on the outside. And the way the theory, the parasite-stress theory, is fundamentally based in knowledge of the evolution, coevolution of host disease dynamics.
Yeah.
And hosts and infectious disease co-evolve. And it's an antagonistic, coevolutionary, ongoing, never-ending race between hosts and parasites. The parasites I mean infectious diseases, are evolving to eat the host and circumvent the host defenses. The host is evolving to defend itself against the parasites. That's ongoing in all species of plants and animals. We all got our bugs that are after us. All species do. And so that dynamic is going on all the time. And it turns out that those coevolutionary races of hosts and parasites are very localized, geographically localized. So over the range of a host species, you get like a mosaic of immunity. You get relative immunity to the local parasites, but you're not immune to the parasites in races on the outside. The host, same host species, but different race on the outside. And these things can be very, very localized. You get different strains of TB in different neighborhoods in Morocco. You get strains of leishmaniasis in different villages that are a few miles apart in Africa, and so forth and so on. Very, very localized. We're getting, all these local strains of COVID popping up. New one in UK now. Just this week was identified. So it's a localized kinds of thing, and you get the local immunity to these infectious diseases. So xenophobia makes sense from the parasite point of view, avoiding parasites, because you avoid infectious diseases on the outside by avoiding foreigners. Neophobia makes sense too, because new ideas come from the outside often, and innovative folks from the outside. You don't want to interact with them or their ideas, because their ideas, and part of the immune response, behavioral and psychological immune response to infectious disease is it overshoots in the sense of it's very open-minded with regard to potential threat. So you get all these outgroup prejudices and so forth that are really extreme and don't make sense on first cut until you realize that the behavioral immunity is designed to accept a lot of false positives adaptively.
So that's like the precautionary principle, correct?
Yeah, precautionary principle. Yeah. That's right. So that's why you get these prejudices, not only just the people that don't look like you and don't talk like you and don't think like you, but people, overweight people, underweight people, those kinds of prejudices are all associated very strongly with conservatism. And so that's the xenophobia part. Then the ethnocentrism part of conservatism also connects to parasite stress in the following way. So when the diseases come, and if you live in an area of high infectious disease, they're coming. When the diseases come, you want strong local support, and you want a strong in-group and extended family and so forth to take care of you and your family to get you through the disease. So you get all these very strong family ties and extended family ties and lifetime friendships and so forth of highly conservative people. And then parochialism, just liking the local and so forth. That's part of ethnocentrism. And let's see, philopatry, I mentioned.
Yeah.
So it keeps you local rather than going into new habitats and hence new areas where new parasites will be. So that's how the conservative thing fits into infectious disease. So liberalism on the other end of the values continuum is a great value system in the sense of openness to different kinds of people. You have a bigger social group. You have a bigger mating pool. You're fine with people that look different from you, different color, different values, all those kinds of things. So it has its benefits, but the cost of liberalism is that openness and interaction with different people put you at risk of infectious disease in areas of high infectious disease. So basically, we started testing this by looking at the relationship between infectious disease levels across regions of the world and values. And the literature on values was published, descriptive literature for every country of the world and states of the U.S. and so forth. The political scientists and cross-cultural psychologists have done a good job in identifying and coming up with ways to measure this stuff, measure the values, and report that in the literature. And the disease information was also in the literature from cross-country data from World Health Organization and places like that, from U.S. data, state data, from CDC. They keep up with infectious disease levels in the states. So we pulled the data and looked at the connection between the two, infectious disease levels and level of collectivism, said differently, level of conservatism across countries and states, and found very, very high correlations between these two. And then, of course, we controlled for things that scholars in these areas, political scientists and cross-cultural psychologists, had thought would be important in explaining these cultural variables. And we control those analytically with standard analytical techniques in our comparative work across countries and across states. And so then experimental psychologists got into it, and very quickly after we did our comparative work and started taking the system into the lab and looking at, showing people disease cues,
yeah,
and looking at effects and change people's personalities. And
as my student did, the one that you sat on the committee, exactly.
Example of that.
Yeah. Well, so that was a fantastic summary. Thank you. So a couple of epistemological points that I want to point to in terms of the importance of your work. Number one, it demonstrates the distinction between proximate explanations and ultimate explanations, in that when you're referring to the political scientists and the cross-cultural psychologists, and you use the term descript, they're describing, what they're doing is they're drawing the what and the how, as we say when it comes to the proximate. You're coming along and saying, yeah, we know that these distributions exist, but why do they exist in that form? That's the kind of ultimate Darwinian why. So that's, I think, number one incredible value of your work. Number two, I think it points again to the fact that evolutionary theorists are not arguing that everything is due to genes and to biology, but rather to an interaction, right? And your work is exactly demonstrating that, right? It's taking a biological issue, right? Distribution of pathogens across different ecosystems, and saying that cultural values, deep-rooted cultural values, both at the cultural level and at the individual level, are in part shaped by the interaction with these biological realities. Number two. Yep. Number three, you're applying, therefore, a behavioral ecological framework, right? Where you're studying differences across cultures that are due to adaptive responses. The classic example of that I love is the distribution of use of spices across culinary traditions, which you know well, right? In hot climates, we have spicier food. In less hot climates, we have less spicy food. If I were a cultural anthropologist, I would simply revel in having identified that the Mexicans have spicier foods than the Swedes, but I would never ask the question why. And now here comes the evolutionists offering us very, very beautifully, in a beautiful way, parsimoniously, the explanation. So I think that's really at the root, if I can compliment your work, that's at the root, in a sense, of why this work is so important, because it's hitting each of those epistemological points smack on.
Yeah. The spice thing, by the way, has been tidied up. Mark Schaller and Damian Murray did a thing where they, like you say, it's the original work was on temperature.
Yeah.
In relation to spice use in the locale, but they actually did the infectious disease, and it works even better.
Oh, really? Eh?
But
so rather than using the temperature as a proxy for the microbial stuff, I actually measure the density.
It is a good proxy.
Yeah, okay.
The parasites, infectious diseases like it warm and moist, ideally, most of them.
Yeah.
And so it's a good proxy. But back to the proximate and ultimate, I want to touch on that just a minute.
Sure.
Parasite-Stress theory of values is a scientific theory, and it's both a proximate and an ultimate scientific theory of how what causes our core values. And the proximate domain, which I've talked about a little bit, it's the way we think it works is have an individual growing up or continuing to grow if it's an adult, but going through life and encountering the world. And if that individual encounters infectious disease levels, and that can be through, the reaction of his or her own immune system, how frequently it's activated, and how chronically it's activated, when activated. It also comes from information from the culture in which the individual lives about infectious disease levels. You got all this information as you're growing up as a kid about infectious disease levels. Some kids are growing up in high infectious disease areas, some in low infectious disease areas. Then when you become adult, of course, you have variation there too in infectious disease levels you're encountering depending on your culture. And so if the information going in is high infectious disease, then you choose values on the conservative end. If it's low infectious disease, you choose values on the liberal end. And these are strategic values, as you indicated. They're adaptive values for local problems, dealing with local problems. And then the ultimate component is evolution by natural selection has built psychological adaptations that are specialized functionally in choosing values. And the analog that's more familiar to people, psychological analog, is the psychological adaptations by which we acquire language. So we grow up, and these are psychological specializations that by which we choose our language, even our dialect, and so forth. And the language and the dialect are for dealing with local problems, communicating locally. The psychological adaptations associated with acquiring values are functionally designed by evolution by selection to get those values that work locally. And so that's the ultimate and the proximate.
Yeah, you're covering both. You're right. Now, one of the reasons, and I actually discussed this in the next book that I'm currently wrapping up, the reason why there is a maintenance of heterogeneity of personality types, or we could extend it to heterogeneity of cultural values, is precisely what we're talking about, which is there isn't a unique optimal personality type across all ecosystems. There isn't a unique set of cultural values that all cultures, right? So some traits are fixed. We now have 10 fingers and toes, unless you have a congenital problem. That's a fixed trait. But our personalities or our cultural values are not fixed precisely because there are too many variances of ecosystems where something that is optimal in one ecosystem would not be optimal in another one. That really captures the gist of it, right?
Yeah. So you get the evolution of condition dependence.
Exactly.
When you've got this ecological variation that is encountered by individuals in a lifetime. And I mean, these psychological adaptations by which we acquire our values are really getting more, much more research needs to be done on characterizing their design. But it's clear that there is some openness to it. They remain somewhat open. So you can take, I mean, some of the research that's a spinoff, we didn't do it, others did it. You bring people into the lab, you show them disease cues, and they become more conservative, more xenophobic, ethnocentric. They become less open to new ideas and so forth, and seeing these disease cues in the lab. And so that this adaptation for acquiring values remains adaptively open.
Right.
You can change a person's personality, basically, make them more open to new experiences, more introverted or more extroverted and so forth, just by showing them disease cues.
Adaptability, forgive me for interrupting you. Adaptability is an adaptation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Beautiful. I love it. I could keep you here for another 2 hours. Let's try to wrap it up with a few personal questions. Yeah. What's next for the great Randy Thornhill? You're still heavily engaged in research. Is this something that you will be doing until your last breath on Earth? May it be in many, many years from now. By the way, you are exactly the model of the pure academic, in that you're not doing this because you want more accolades. You've got all the accolades. You're not doing it to get a full professorship or get tenure. That's what a real academic should be doing, pursuing knowledge unencumbered, unfettered by extrinsic rewards. So what's next for you? Just going to keep publishing?
Yeah, I've got this insect study I'm going to wrap up, and it's really, really cool. And I just got distracted into other things when I was a grad student, some other cool projects, and didn't finish it. But got that I want to finish, and hopefully this summer. Then now the big project I'm working on is on human rights, and that's part of this Parasite-Stress thing. So, and cross-nationally and across the states, trying to come up with a metric for across U.S. states human rights. There is a human rights researchers. It's a big area of research. Human rights researchers have come up with ways to measure cross-national human rights. And of course, Parasite-Stress and Conservatism predicts all that. But we're trying to come up with a state measure too of human rights legislation and attitudes and values. And I'm working with some other guys on that. So that's going to be our big thing pretty soon.
Oh, very nice. Okay, last question, also personal in nature. So one of the things that I talk about in my forthcoming book, in one of the last chapters, is you've lived a good life if at the end of your life you have few regrets that you could think of. And one of my former professors of psychology, when I was a doctoral student at Cornell, his name is Tom Gilovich, and he pioneered the distinction between two forms of regret. Regret due to action. I regret the fact that I cheated on my wife and now my marriage has dissolved. So that's a regret due to something that I did, action, versus regret due to inaction. I regret that I went into medicine and followed my dad's footstep. I hate medicine. I should have been a dancer. That's really what I was interested in. And I regret that I never pursued my career as a dancer, as an artist, as a whatever. And it turns out that over the long term, our greatest regrets usually are ones of inaction, things that I didn't pursue. That's what looms in my mind. That's what causes me to lose my tranquility of mind. So if I were to ask you at this stage, and you're hardly at the end of your life, but if I were to ask you, if you look back now at your 1-2 biggest regrets, do you care to share with us what those might be?
I've never even thought about it.
Really?
No. I mean, I've been very fortunate to have been raised in a way, like under a rainbow my whole life. I've been lucky. I mean, the culture I grew up in, very conservative and so forth, but that generated a lot of curiosity in me. So that even had a benefit,
right.
All the prejudice and so forth that I grew up with that I didn't have. And that was a big mystery. And so even all the terrible prejudice. I mean, I can tell stories about this, like when I was a kid, in the culture I grew up in, it was common for middle class and upper class families white families, to hire a black woman to come in and raise the kids, basically.
Right.
So my family did that, and I had a white mama and a black mama.
Yeah. By the way, I had exactly the same thing in Lebanon. You would have like the she would be called a Selma, like a nanny, and actually her name was Selma. She was a Muslim woman who, when she left our home when I was 8 years old, I cried much harder than had I lost my mother then, because I considered her to be more my mother than my actual biological mother. So I understand that dynamic. Say again?
Why did she leave?
I think she was getting married, and so she was already in her 40s, and she had really spent probably 15, 20 years. I mean, I think even before I was born, she had been our live-in sort of, I guess you would call it here, nanny. Yeah, and then right. she was in her 40s, she was going to get married. And I remember the day I was 8 years old, this is before the Civil War began, and my mother was coming into my room to break this news to me, knowing that I would be devastated by this news, because this was really akin to my mother, because she was really the one who was raising me.
Boy, I got you. I know it. Let me explain my situation.
Sure.
So the difference is in the Old South, it was against the law for white and blacks to live under the same roof. So these women that would come in and take care of the white kids they were there for the day. They'd have to go home at the end of the day, and they couldn't use a white bathroom in the home. So my family built a special bathroom for her, and I was of course told not to use the bathroom, but I did because she was my mama. Why is my mama? Right. But anyway, my black mama died when I was 13, and that was a tragedy, because in my mind she was my mama, just right. Like your nanny was your mama. And my psychology said she was my mama as much as my birth mama, because she had been with me. They hired her when my mother was pregnant to come in and start helping. And so she got sick, very sick. And my family would not allow me to go see her. She lived in a little shack across the track, so to speak.
Oh, my God.
I couldn't go see her. And finally, they broke down and allowed me to go over to see her, but I couldn't go in her house. I had to talk to her standing on the front porch. She was in the bed inside a little one-room shack. She was in the bed dying, and I spoke to her from the porch, and she died 5 days later.
Oh, my God.
The prejudice and so forth of the family, through my research and all, I, understood them better. And I mean, that was parental care from their point of view.
Yeah.
Protect me from infectious disease. They were being good parents, but at the same time, it was very, very hard on me because they wouldn't let me see my mother. And even after she died, they wouldn't let me. There was a funeral. That was kind of a mess, but she died alone, and they buried her somewhere.
Wow.
The black cemeteries, they just bury them in at the time, and but nobody would tell me where she was buried. I still don't know where she was buried.
Have you been able to stay in touch with anyone from her family, either immediate family or extended family, through the years?
She had a husband of sorts, but he was not around much. She had one child, one boy, and as soon as he hit 18, he left the South, part of the Black Migration, as it was called, beginning with Reconstruction in the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, black folks left the South because it was so dangerous down there. They were hanging, big sport, hanging black men on the weekend, and black boys. And so he left, associated with the Black Migration, and went to, she thought it was Chicago. but she never heard from him again. So I think he died up there somewhere, and trying to find a better world.
On the 1 in a million chance that that gentleman is still alive and is watching this show, please reach out to Randy. My goodness, would that be an unbelievable story? My goodness, what a story. Thank you for sharing that.
Millions of those stories.
Say again?
I've got lots of stories.
Well,
I'm sure you've got a lot of stories.
Oh, I've got a lot too. But I think the fact that you're able to have lived your life without having experienced too many debilitating regrets, I think it speaks to your fortitude, maybe your fortune. So that's.
I'll try to spin it toward the positive.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all that stuff, and I still got good friends down there in the South, and I have that traditionalism, that component of traditionalism. I mean, I grew up on the Tennessee River, and I was, fishing and hunting and swimming and all the time. My family bought me a boat when I was a little kid and go to the river and fish and hunt and stuff. And it's just a beautiful place, absolutely beautiful place, and just a lot of hatred.
But I mean, I know that objectively there's a lot less now. But if you're talking to people privately, will that hatred still come out, or do you feel that in a few generations since those stories of yours, we've pretty much eradicated that nonsense out of people's hearts?
The younger people, it's generation related. So the people after, it has to do with parasite level. The whole social and cultural revolution of the 60s and 70s. I mean, that occurred specifically and only in the West because of lower infectious disease problems. Emancipation from infectious disease generated all the hippies and liberalism and civil rights and that whole thing. That's one big piece of our story. You start off with chlorinated water in the 1920s, and then you go to antibiotics in the 40s. Also, you go to vector control in the 40s with insecticides, and the history of health interventions is very well known by medical historians and so forth. So we put all that on top of what was going on in the West. How the hell did we get all those young hippies in the 60s and 70s, specifically in the West? And it was, lower relative emancipation of infectious disease, less infectious disease than humans had ever encountered in the history of humans.
Yeah. Amazing. What would be interesting is to see a longitudinal study where you then have an uptake again of exposure to parasites.
We're getting now with
exactly, and then you see then you should see an uptake in xenophobia and racism and so on. You've got that data?
No, I don't, but people are studying it.
I like it.
Yeah, wow. This is going on and on and on.
That's beautiful. Fantastic.
It's really nice.
Fantastic.
Looking at increases in some conservative values, especially in more diseasey places. Again, back to the latitude, southern United States and so forth. And so that's going on.
Well, listen, Randy, continued success. May you be as happy in the next stage of your life as you've been in the past. Please stay on the line so I could say goodbye to you offline. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It was such a delight and honor to have you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great. Enjoyed it.
Cheers. Thank you.